So I want to start with a question for this morning. This is something that's meant to be participatory. And so by a show of hands, and I promise this is nothing embarrassing, by a show of hands, who here would consider themselves sort of a glass is half full kind of person, an optimistic person by their outlook? Okay, all right, fair number of you. And then how about on the other side, even if maybe you don't want to admit it, who here maybe would consider themselves a glasses half empty kind of person, and in the pessimist camp? All right, some of you, definitely. All right, okay. Well, as a planner and as a preparer that I kind of am, someone who tends to sort of prepare for the worst, no matter what happens to be going on, I am definitely of that pessimist persuasion. That's just my natural core being of who I happen to be. However, there are areas of my life that I am stubbornly optimistic. Basically refusing to have a negative outlook about the future in those particular areas. One of those such areas is actually my own life in general. My own life. I've never wanted to look at my life as if the best days were behind me. I've always wanted to look at it as there are better things ahead, better things. Even if I go through difficulty, if I go through challenges, looking at those things as ways that God, or even just the world, is actually improving me as a person. And so even myself, kind of improving in that way. And so my own life, having better days ahead, even though there are all sorts of trials and challenges that I might happen to face. I've also had that perspective with regard to this church, Community Alliance Church, expecting even from the very beginning that this church God has amazing things ahead for this church. And I even remember, back during my initial, pastoral interview here when it was, the decision was being made if I was going to come here or not, as I was kind of meeting with people. And we talked during that time about, the possibility, what did the future look like for the church? Can we expect growth? What does God have for this church? And back then and even today, my attitude was and still is that God can and will grow this church, not only spiritually, but numerically. That was and continues to be my expectation, my positive outlook for this church, that stubbornly optimistic view. But there's another area in my life that I've had sort of this uncompromising optimism. Uncompromising. But I think that in this area, unlike the other two, my opinion is not only perhaps uncommon amongst Christians, but maybe even a little bit controversial amongst Christians. But we're going to get there and to what exactly that is in just a little bit. Now, our passage today comes from the Gospel of Matthew. We're taking a break just for this 1 week from our 1 Corinthians sermon series. But next week, Pastor Jack, he's going to pick up right where we left off before. He's going to be preaching from 1 Corinthians chapter 15. But for today, if you've not already done so, open your Bibles to Matthew chapters 24 and 25, as that's what we're going to be looking in this morning. Now, Chapter 25, Matthew 25, as was just read for us by Tom, this is a parable that Jesus gave about these 10 bridesmaids. And this is a parable that Jesus gave towards the end of his earthly life, earthly ministry. But it was part of a rather lengthy teaching that Jesus gave, and if you read through the Gospel of Matthew, you can see all of this. Jesus, at this particular part and this particular teaching, was talking about things that were going to occur in the end times. Now, the previous chapter, in chapter 24 of Matthew, Jesus had just spoken about he basically gave a prophecy that the temple in Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. That happened just prior to chapter 24. And then after he said that, his disciples actually came up to him and asked him about this future event. And we actually read this starting in verse 3 in Matthew 24. It says, later Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives. His disciples came to him privately and said, "Tell us, when will all of this happen? What sign will signal your return and the end of the world?" So they wanted to know not only what was going to happen in the end, but what they should expect to see as signs indicating that the end was about to arrive. So then we continue in here, and Jesus told them about this. And this is continuing in verse 4. Jesus told them, "Don't let anyone mislead you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah. They will deceive many, and you will hear of wars and threats of wars. But don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in many parts of the world. But all this is only the first of the birth pains, with more to come." So it needs to be noted here that everything Jesus was sort of prophesying in this particular part of Matthew 24 was just the beginning of the birth pains. That's what it was. And then verse 6 specifically says that the end is not going to follow immediately. The end is not going to follow immediately. In other words, all these things are going to happen in the future, and they're going to happen before the end finally arrives. But these are not signs that the end is immediately going to happen afterwards. It's going to happen sometime after that, but the end could still be years, if not centuries, away at this particular point. These are simply signs that the end is ahead in the future. Like birth pains, this is sort of the beginning of the end. That's what these things signify. And then Jesus continued in verse 9. And he said this, "Then you will be arrested, persecuted, and killed. You will be hated all over the world because you are my followers. And many will turn away from me and betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and will deceive many people. Sin will be rampant everywhere, and the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And the good news about the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world, so that all nations will hear it. And then the end will come." Now, verses 9 through 13 here have been notoriously difficult to interpret and especially apply, not because it's difficult to understand what they say. I mean, that's fairly clear what they're saying. But they're difficult for people to interpret because Jesus says you. He says you in this passage when he is talking to the disciples. Well, did Jesus mean them personally when he said you? Or maybe he meant you Christians, including perhaps us Christians for today. And then verse 34 makes this whole understanding even more complicated when Jesus said, "I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass from the scene until all these things take place." Well, was Jesus talking about the generation he was speaking to, that he was part of, when again he said you, or was he talking about a future generation that was maybe years, if not centuries away? That once all of these things start to happen, that generation was not going to end before the end would finally come. Or is he suggesting somehow that maybe the end was going to come in that current generation in some way, or at least some of these things were going to be fulfilled in the generation that he was currently in? And these are not simple questions to answer, and I don't pretend that these are simple questions to answer. In fact, as people have tried to interpret Matthew 24 and try to put a timeline on things, interpretations have been all over the place, really. Some have pretty much seen virtually everything in Matthew 24 as being events that happen or will happen in the future, even the future beyond us. While others actually interpret much of what has happened in Matthew 24 as already having happened, with maybe just a few things that are still to come in the future. Now, my goal here today is not to try and work through all of this and establish a timeline of events or exactly when each of these things or how each of these things will happen in the future. that really is beyond the scope of the discussion for this morning. Rather, for our larger purposes of today, my purpose is to highlight some general understandings from Matthew 24 and Matthew 25 that pretty much all Christians agree to. Pretty much all Christians agree on some of these things. In Matthew 24:14, Jesus said, "And this gospel of my kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." And I think it is generally agreed upon, again, by pretty much all Christians, and this is true whether you think most of Matthew 24 is in the past, or you think much of it is, or if not all of it, is going to happen in the future. Most Christians would still agree that this specific verse, verse 14, is still to come in the future. This is still speaking of something in the future. So what most Christians would agree to about end times is first, that the gospel has not been preached to the whole world. The gospel has not been preached to the whole world. Again, most Christians would agree on this. And second, which is maybe obvious, is that the end has not yet come. Okay? Most Christians would agree on both of these things. And Jesus, of course, in this teaching in Matthew 24 and other places, also paired the end of the world to his own final arrival into the world. So those things, the end coming and Jesus finally arriving, he paired both of those things together. So in verse 29 of Matthew 24, we read this. "Immediately after the anguish of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will give no light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then at last the sign of the Son of Man is coming will appear in the heavens. And there will be deep mourning along with the peoples of the earth, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." So this is speaking of aspects, part of the tribulation events at the very end of the world. And tribulation speaks of a very unpleasant, which is obviously an understatement, but a very unpleasant and difficult time to come at some point in the future. But notice, there's this tribulation right before the final arrival of Jesus. So those two things are very closely connected together. And whether you're a post-millennialist or a premillennialist, or whether you don't even know what those terms mean, many Christians still tend to agree that this is speaking of this final arrival of Jesus that's yet to come. So difficult times, tribulation, and then the arrival of Jesus. And this arrival, of course, is Jesus' ultimate victory, his ultimate victory, which heralds his ultimate and final conquering of evil, which was, of course, won on the cross and through the resurrection, but ultimately resolved in the end with a sweeping away of death and sweeping away of Satan in the very end. And so this arrival of Jesus, as is spoken of right here, is going to be so obvious at that point in history that all the earth is going to know that it is finally arrived. Now, there's disagreement amongst Christians about who is actually going to be present on earth at that time. Christians do disagree about that when this final arrival occurs. However, again, there's some agreement. And what I think we can all pretty much agree on is that first, again, it's going to be very unpleasant right before that final arrives. And just kind of going back to this slide here. So the gospel will not have been preached yet to the whole world. The end has not yet come. So this is where we are right now. It'll be very unpleasant before Jesus finally arrives at the end, his final return. And that God wins in the end. Okay, so very uncontroversial ideas about the end of times that, again, I think pretty much all Christians are in agreement about. But there's something else that I think that we can very commonly agree upon as Christians when it comes to end times. And this brings us to our passage for this morning. And what we read about was the 10 bridesmaids, this parable of Jesus. And again, Jesus was teaching about this right after he explained all of these things that were going to happen at the very end of the world. Now, Jesus is teaching about the bridesmaids. In addition to many other teachings that Jesus had about how things were and attitudes that we should have towards the end of the world, we can actually read about a lot of this stuff in a bunch of different places in Scripture. But I want to go through some of this stuff specifically from Matthew 25. So, starting in verse 1, Jesus again said, "Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 bridesmaids who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom." So this is what he is explaining. This is what the kingdom of heaven is going to be like. And so he set up this whole story. There's 10 foolish bridesmaids, 10 wise bridesmaids. The foolish ones didn't have enough oil for their lamps. And so the story proceeds along with the bridegroom in the story, who's a symbol of Jesus, returning, this bridegroom and the end of the world being delayed. Jesus took longer to arrive than was expected. And really, this is longer than any of them expected. It wasn't just that the wise ones knew and the foolish ones didn't. All of them thought, they found the bridegroom to be delayed. It took him longer than expected. Then we read in verse 6. At midnight, they were roused by a shout. So all 10 of them, "Look, the bridegroom is coming. Come out and meet him." All the bridesmaids got up and prepared their lamps. Then the 5 foolish ones asked the others, "Please give us some of your oil, because our lamps are going out." But the others replied, "We don't have enough for all of us. Go to a shop and buy some for yourselves." But while they had gone to buy oil, the bridegroom came. Then those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was locked. Now, this is not a commentary on sharing, just to make that blunt and clear. Rather, this is a commentary on being ready for the arrival of Jesus, for the end, when Jesus finally comes. And we don't know exactly when it's going to be. That's kind of what the indication of this parable is. But we need to be ready for when the end actually comes. And the teaching here is that the consequences for not being ready are not good. In the last few verses of the parable, we read this. Later, when the other 5 bridesmaids returned, they stood outside calling, "Lord, Lord, open the door for us." But he called back, "Believe me, I don't know you." And then Jesus concluded this by saying, "So you too must keep watch, for you do not know the day or hour of my return." We don't want to be caught off guard when Jesus returns. Jesus is going to return unexpectedly. So we need to be ready for his arrival. And so I think this also is a generally agreed upon principle by Christians, that we need to be prepared for Jesus' return. Again, agreed upon by pretty much everybody, we need to be prepared for Jesus' return. Now, our denomination, the Christian Missionary Alliance, refers to this idea as Jesus' imminent return. Basically, Jesus is going to return at some time, but there's no real prerequisites that have to be fulfilled for that to happen. We're not, waiting for just one other thing to be checked off before Jesus will show up. It could be at any moment, and it could surprise us all. Now, yes, we read in verse 14 of Matthew 24 that the gospel must be proclaimed to the whole world, and then Jesus will return. But if you think about it, given the way that the world is today and has been for a very long time with the internet, with social media, enabling widespread, pretty much instantaneous evangelism, that criteria can really be accomplished at any time. Again, unexpectedly, at any moment, heralding in the return of Christ. And we don't know exactly when that is going to be. But that it is going to happen is undeniable from reading Scripture. And it is this concept of us being prepared for Jesus' return that I really want us to focus on this morning. As soon as you entered the workforce, you've probably had heard, maybe you're kind of in retirement now, but at some point you probably heard someone say that as soon as you start working, you should start preparing for retirement. Now, retirement may have been 30 years or more off at that point, but there's a good chance somebody told you even then you need to prepare for retirement. And maybe you heeded that advice, maybe you didn't heed that advice. And likely at additional points along that whole, your whole working career, and you may still be in there at some stage, you've heard the same thing over and over again. Prepare for retirement. Start saving now so that when you retire, you will be ready for it. Because it's sort of the warning associated with that advice is that if you don't prepare for retirement, either you're not going to be able to retire, or if you do retire, you're just not going to have very much money to live on. You'll basically be in poverty at that point in the future. So that we need to prepare for retirement is undeniable advice. It's wise advice. That's something that we should be doing, preparing for eventually when we retire. But it must be noted that preparing for retirement is not as simple as just putting money in the bank. I mean, that's an important start, but preparing for retirement is more complicated than that. And the thing is that if we don't look at sort of the extra aspects of what preparing really looks like, we can actually hurt our ability to retire well. Any financial advisor will tell you that what retirement ultimately looks like, what preparing for retirement ultimately looks like, is going to depend on several factors. Several things are going to kind of go into this preparing. Preparing is going to differ, for example, based on what the economy looks like in that moment. Not necessarily just at retirement, but even as you're moving up towards retirement. Preparing is going to look different based on what the economic environment is that you're in. And it's going to differ depending on how far off your actual retirement date is. If the economy is booming in the moment, you would be advised by a financial advisor to put your money someplace that you can really take advantage of the market, surging in that moment, to kind of take advantage of how your money will grow at that point in time. But if the market is contracting, if the economy is contracting at that moment, you would be advised to maybe put your money in a more conservative investment so you don't look at and face as much economic loss. If retirement for you is 10 or 20 or 30 years out, most financial advisors are going to recommend that you invest in some things that are a little bit riskier. But because of their risk, are likely to encourage and experience much more growth. Now, of course, because they are riskier investments, they're going to experience more loss in a downturn of the market, but your financial growth is also going to experience much more of an upturn when the market goes the other direction. So statistically, the way the market works, in the end, if you kind of ride out these cycles of the ups and downs, participating in something riskier, if retirement is far off, you're going to do better in the long run. You'll be better prepared for retirement. But of course, since that natural cycle of the market with its ups and downs, typically when the market cycles, it can be 7 or more years that it kind of takes to go through and run through a full cycle. If your retirement is less than 10 years away, you don't want to risk needing your money when the market is down and you've kind of lost on those investments. So most financial advisors at that point in kind of the looking forward to the future in your own retirement are going to suggest investing in a more conservative way to make sure that there's less risk of financial loss. And if you don't follow this sort of general financial advice, which I think is sort of generally agreed upon by financial advisors, you're actually going to hurt your own retirement. If you choose to just be very financially conservative your entire career, maybe you never put your money in the market, maybe you just keep it in the bank, you are going to minimize loss, that is true, but your money is also not going to grow as much as it could statistically grow. So in the end, ultimately, you're not going to have the buying power for those retirement years, and maybe even have to put off retirement as a result. But on the other hand, if you always choose to be financially risky and you don't heed the advice of you're getting close to retirement, maybe you should pull back, always financially risky, then you're likely to experience financial loss when you really need that money. But there's a point in me giving this very specific example about retirement. Following all of this advice, whether you are investing conservatively, whether you are investing in a more risky fashion, whatever it looks like, all of this involves preparing for retirement for the future. It's all part of preparing. Preparing looks a little bit different, but it's all considered preparing for the future. And what preparing for a good and solid retirement is going to look like is going to change depending on the current economic environment. It's going to change. It needs to change depending on the economic environment, as well as how far off your actual retirement date is in the future. So the time in the environment impacts how you need to prepare. Well, this way of preparing for retirement is the same sort of way that I would argue we should be thinking about preparing for Jesus' eventual return. That we have to prepare is, of course, undeniable. Again, all Christians agree we must prepare for Jesus' return. But preparing for Jesus' return, we should not think of this as sort of a cookie cutter, do it the same way all the time type of thing. How we prepare for Jesus' return should change depending on our cultural environment in which we live. And not changing, even refusing to change in response to the cultural environment, can and likely will actually hurt our ability to best prepare for Jesus' return. And let me explain exactly what I mean by that. Think about for a moment how differently you would act as a Christian if you thought that the environment that you lived in was one of mass persecution in the United States. If you thought Christians in America right now were being rounded up, they're being imprisoned for what they believed, like they are in many other parts of the world, if that's what you thought was happening right here, you would act and behave very differently right now than as opposed to maybe you thought that we were in the middle of a nationwide revival right now. The way you would act would be very, very different. If you thought we were in the middle of mass persecution, you'd likely function, you'd likely evangelize, share about the gospel with a lot of caution. But if you thought that there was mass revival going on, well, very likely you'd be out on the streets, very openly proclaiming the gospel and the truth about Jesus. But if you got it wrong, if maybe you thought the opposite of what was actually going on and you acted that way instead, if you basically didn't understand the cultural environment in which we are actually living, your evangelism and your ultimate impact for the gospel, for the kingdom of God, would likely be cut short or will be much less impactful than it could otherwise be because you're being needlessly risky or needlessly conservative in your approach to sharing the truth and love of Jesus. Just like with saving for retirement, being super conservative all the time doesn't necessarily and probably won't help you. Nor does being super risky all the time. It doesn't actually help. In the end, we have to act and we have to change as Christians in accordance with the times and the environment in which we live. If we don't understand the signs of our times, if we don't understand the signs of the times and we act in a way that's really not in accordance with reality, we actually damage the progression of God's kingdom. We damage the progression of God's kingdom. For the advancement of the gospel, we need to know and understand the days and the culture in which we live for the ultimate benefit of advancing God's mission. And this is really the main thing that I want to get across for this morning, because I think this is really what God has for us today. While there are many ways we can prepare for Jesus' return. There are many ways we can impact our culture. there are, of course, always ways that are more impactful and ways that are less impactful, more beneficial and less beneficial. So we shouldn't just sort of invest in the culture how somebody else invests, or maybe invest in a way that we've always invested, how we maybe have invested in our culture in the past. I mean, that may have been good back then, and it may be good one day in the future, just like there are cycles in the market. The way you invest financially may be good at some point, it may be good in the future, but that doesn't mean it's good right now. We have to make sure we are understanding the days in which we are living today for the greatest benefit for our culture. Now don't misunderstand what I'm saying when I'm saying that we need to evaluate where our culture is. This is not a plea for us to be culturally relevant. I know that term can have a lot of bad connotations. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is we need to understand how and when to best leverage our current cultural environment to best advance the gospel. This is not trying to be culturally relevant. That's not what this is. This is if, maybe people used to gather in place A, but now they are gathering in place B. Understanding the culture and the cultural environment means, well, now we spend more resources to invest in place B rather than just continue to invest in place A because that's what we've always done in the past. This is understanding and responding to our culture in a kingdom-positive way. But the challenge, of course, is to properly understand our culture, to properly get an idea of what's going on in our culture and what that means for our actions as Christians so we can best invest in the future. And this is where I think I have maybe a bit of a controversial opinion. Now, I don't derive this opinion from Scripture, so this has nothing to do with a right theology. You can disagree with me about this. That's totally fine. But what I hope is that what you can see, at least from what I've already said so far today, that how we think about our cultural environment does matter. It matters because it ultimately impacts how we are going to invest in our culture. It impacts how we are going to advance God's kingdom for the better or perhaps for the worst. So we need to take this analysis of our culture environment very seriously and not just kind of continue to go through the motions as maybe we always have been. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that I'm sort of a pessimist at core. But when it comes to my own life, I'm an optimist about the future. When it comes to the future of this church, again, I am an optimist about the future of this church. But my perhaps, controversial opinion is that when it comes to this world that we live in and the growth of Christianity over even the next several decades, I'm also very optimistic. I firmly believe that we are actually living today in one of the wealthiest and freest nations to ever exist on the planet, even today, the United States, freest nations, and from a democratic and religious standpoint, again, one of the freest nations to exist in our time period. But I also believe that we are living in one of the best, most prosperous, most peaceful, and most Christian times to ever exist on the history of this planet. Ever. One of the best, most prosperous, most peaceful, and most Christian times ever. That is what I believe. This is my controversial opinion. But as a result of this perspective that I have, I believe that we should be heavily leveraging this understanding of our culture for the benefit of the gospel. Now, this position might sound a bit crazy to you. Maybe you think I'm crazy. But I want to encourage you to just take a few minutes here to consider this with me. Because if I am correct in my optimism, that impacts how we as Christians invest in our culture. And I assure you, I am not a blind optimist. I'm not a blind optimist. In fact, I think that the data very much supports my perspective. And I think it's, a fairly strong argument. And it's, of course, things that you can access yourself. You don't have to agree with me. But I hope if nothing else, this perspective is at least an encouragement to you. First of all, did you know that there are more Christians today by number and by percentage in the global population than we have ever before seen in the history of the world? Ever before. And I know the common perception is that Christianity is shrinking. There are less Christians today. Not correct. That is not what the data shows. Now, the growth trend worldwide is fairly flat, but it is definitely not decreasing. Now, sure, there are pockets, there are places where there are less Christians. In the United States, there are clearly less Christians today than there have been in the past. And that's true in other parts of the world, of course, as well. But this is not what we see as a whole. It's not what we see of Christianity as a whole. And if you look at countries like China, we know that Christianity is practically exploding in those countries today. According to the World Christian Database, if you were to look at that, in 2023, 32.4% of our planet is professing Christian. And also, perhaps surprisingly, and I would not have thought this myself, but if you look at the numbers in that same report, the number of Christian martyrs, those Christians dying for their faith, is actually significantly down. Significantly down. If you compare it to the 1970s, that was kind of the peak of Christian martyrdom. I mean, there's more people on the planet, there's more Christians today, but martyrdom is even down. These are positive things. Less Christians are being killed around the world. But there are other positive things that we can see in our world today. Now, you probably know this, but maybe you don't really think about it, but life expectancy today. I know you can't really see this graph very well. That's a trend going up. That's all I guess you have to know. But life expectancy today is the highest it has ever been for thousands of years, maybe ever in human history. On average, people live longer today than pretty much any other time in all of human history. This is a positive thing. Humans are living longer. Now, I know that there are places around the world where war is rampant. I mean, Ukraine is suffering from war right now. This doesn't mean, everything's positive in every single pocket, that everything's perfect everywhere. But did you know that the likelihood today of any individual person being killed in a global conflict over the past 20 years, if you kind of look at the last 20 years of world events, it's the lowest it has ever been since the 1400s. 1400s. Lowest chance, probability worldwide, of being killed in a global conflict. And again, this is pretty huge. World poverty, plummeting. Significantly lower than it has ever been in human history. Literacy rates, the highest they have ever been in the history of the world. Even think about the U.S. economy. Just 3 years ago, our economy was the best it had ever been. Ever. Highest it had ever been. Unemployment in 2019 was the lowest it had been since 1969. This is all very positive. There are really good things happening in the world and even in our own country. But what about moral issues? You might ask, what about moral issues? Where's our country with that stuff? I mean, aren't things going, in a negative direction with that? Well, don't forget that Roe versus Wade just got repealed not very long ago. And the data shows that if you actually look at abortion rates over the course of recent history, they are down. They're at levels that were similar to when abortion was first legalized. Even the number of abortion facilities are the lowest it has ever been in our nation's history. And the data even shows that worldwide abortions are down. Now, of course, with anything, there's still work that needs to be done. I mean, not everything is, hunky-dory and perfect. But I think there's a lot of things that we can look at that show a very positive trend for the future. But maybe you're still thinking, yeah, but, if you were to look, 100 years ago, things were better back then. The United States, in the 1923, must have been better. Now, in 1923, America was, at a time that was very positive. People were very positive about where we were as a country, what the future had. This was, the roaring 20s. People were excited about what was going on in our country. It was a good time in America. But keep in mind that at that time, the average life expectancy was 55. Less than 50% of Americans owned their own homes. This was just 5 years after World War I, which was the third largest conflict of deaths in all of human history. And this was just 6 years before the Great Depression. 20% unemployment, 50% of children did not have adequate food, housing, or health care. And all that, of course, was followed shortly by World War II, which was the deadliest war in all of human history. Was 1923 really better than today? I personally am not really of that persuasion. But maybe you have to go back further. Look at 1823. Again, 1820s, early 1820s, this was a very positive time in American history. Americans were excited about what was going on. There was a huge expansion in the country. People were venturing out west. We were even in the middle of a religious revival during that time in history. But 10 years before 1823, the British had just burned down the White House and the Capitol building. The average life expectancy was under 40. The United States was still heavily entrenched in slavery, and the Civil War was just 40 years off into the future. Was that time period really better than today? Even morally better? And personally, I'm not convinced that that is true. Now, I don't want to pretend that we don't have any moral issues or otherwise issues in our society today. Obviously, we do. We have all sorts of problems in our society, in our world today. And I don't want to pretend that these are not real issues. I don't want to pretend that we don't have some aspects of our culture that are going in the wrong direction. It is also true that in some parts of our world, people are worse off today than they were 100 years ago. The two big, I think, issues that most of us are aware of, just culturally, specifically for the United States, is that there are less Christians today in the United States than there have been throughout history. The number, percentage-wise, of Christians in the United States is decreasing. This is a big deal. This is something that's important, negative trend that we need to recognize. That's not good. Also, I think worldwide, we can see that sexual immorality is going the wrong direction. Again, I think that's pretty obvious for us to see. Also a big deal, something that we should not ignore as Christians. And we need to invest in our culture by keeping those realities in mind. These are realities. We need to keep them in mind so we can best impact our future. It would not be beneficial for us to look at the positive trends, many things that are positive, and use that to try and understand how we should impact those areas that maybe are trending in the wrong direction. But it would also not be beneficial for us to look at those things that are maybe trending in a negative direction and then use that understanding to figure out how we should deal with all the things that are trending in the positive direction for the best impact of our future. We must understand the cultural environment in which we live, even in the nuanced different ways, and we must invest as Christians accordingly. But I do think that I have lots of reason to have optimism about the future. I'm optimistic for the future of my children. I'm optimistic for the future of the United States and of the world. And I'm optimistic for the development and continued development of Christianity and its impact on our world, despite the fact that there are very real negatives that we can see going on around us. But I simply do not believe that our world, or really even our country, is swirling down the toilet right now. That is not my perspective. And I believe this data, just as some of it, supports that perspective. And again, you don't have to agree with me on this. This is not about, you got to agree with me on how I'm looking at all these things. But please do your own evaluation. Because if you only listen to the news, that's kind of your whole scope of things, right or left, whatever perspective you look at, all you're going to hear is that we're on the brink of apocalypse. That's all the news ever says. On the right, we hear about economic meltdown and moral decay. On the left, we hear about environmental disaster and humanitarian crises. Like, always the apocalypse. Why is it always doom and gloom? Like, why is that all they ever talk about? And the answer, I think, is human nature. Because we're all drawn to the car wreck and the house fire, despite the millions of other great things that are going on in the world. It doesn't really matter to us how the rest of the world looks. We all want to gawk at the disaster. And so this is why catastrophe and outrage and fear sells so well. This is what draws the attention of most of our media, most of our influencers. So of course, this is why the media focuses on all of this stuff. But I think the objective data speaks louder than the talking heads. So I want to actually combat this doom and gloom perspective because I want to make sure that we are in alignment with reality. Because when we are not in alignment with reality, it ultimately damages our ability to best prepare for Jesus' return. And it does that because it tempts us to invest in our culture in a way that doesn't respond, doesn't even correlate with the cultural environment in which we live. We need to rightly understand the signs of our times. Now, there may be and will be, I'm sure, times to hunker down, to operate in secrecy, to move subversively and slowly as Christians in America like there are in other parts of the world. But I don't think we should be doing that today. Rather, I think we should be heavily and publicly leveraging our freedoms of speech, freedoms of expression, freedoms of religion. I think we need to be heavily investing in the next generation of Christians to enable them to carry the torch into the future. And we can very openly and very aggressively do that right now in this country where many Christians just can't do that around the world. Now, sometimes people will say, Christianity is only one generation away from extinction. That basically, if you don't make Christians of the next generation, then that's it. It's over. And there is truth to that, of course, but I would argue that is sort of the pessimistic side of the coin. The optimistic side of that coin is that we are only one generation away from significantly transforming our culture for the better. That if we are able to, through the empowerment of the Holy Spirit, we can really impact this next generation, and thus the entire fabric of our society. Our entire country can be transformed. And there's no reason to believe that is not possible. By all accounts, that's where China is, and that's where China will be in 20 years. Their whole nation is being transformed. And like Rome, way back when, was transformed from the inside out, that same exact thing can happen in the United States today, in the years to come. We are not destined for Christian extinction. But if we think that the country is just sort of swirling down the toilet, if that's our perspective, we might find that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if we think that we have better days ahead for us, well, that promotes investment, that promotes buy-in for the long haul. Now, investing in the next generation, investing in children, it's extremely important. It's what we do here. It's what we should continue to do. And that investment can prove to be revolutionary. But that's also an investment that's probably going to take 20 to 30 years to actually bear fruit. But I don't think we even have to wait that long, honestly. Because investing in adults right now can have a significant impact, even if you're just starting from ground zero right now, in just 3 to 5 years. When Jesus' disciples joined him, think about this. A lot of them, maybe they weren't even particularly religious when they joined him. They saw something about Jesus. They followed him as a disciple. But in just 3 years, they went from nobodies to the leaders of a religious movement that ultimately transformed the world. Many of you here today can testify to a similar trajectory in your own life. I know of people here who were kind of being poured into, invested into before I showed up here. Several of you who maybe weren't even Christian when this all kind of began. But today, you're leaders in this church. There are several of you here who were Christian, but maybe you didn't really know that much, or you weren't really, involved in any way. But again, just a few years later, today, you have transitioned into leading ministries here. Some of you have seen those transformations in 8 years, 5 years, even less at times. Really not that long at all. And the version of you from maybe just a few years ago probably wouldn't even recognize you today. There's been that much transformation. And I've seen this generation of leaders, those who've emerged and are kind of taking on these new roles, already pouring heavily into other people who are growing tremendously. By all accounts, I've seen the growth in the people that they are pouring into. And I believe that just another 2 to 3 years down the road, we're going to see the next generation of leaders emerge who will in turn be pouring into more and more people. We are actually seeing life and cultural transformation happening here in this church community, moving in a positive direction in very real time. And to me, this is further proof that our culture is not too far gone. This isn't just a bunch of Christians kind of come to the church and then grow as Christians. In many cases, this is people who are agnostic. They're atheists. They have nothing to do with Christianity. Yet we still see this life transformation. And the more things that progress here, the more lives and culture gets impacted outside of these walls. And as that wave of transformation and multiplication sort of ripples out over the next 3 or 6 or 9 years, it becomes exponential in its growth. And as long as we continue to nurture and invest in that growth, it doesn't take too long to dramatically impact and transform the culture at large. The thing is that what most often limits us as Christians, as we are trying to impact the world for God, often the thing that limits us is that we wrongly evaluate our culture and our cultural environment. So we invest in the future wrongly. We think the culture is too hard-hearted to respond. We think the culture is too lost, it's unrecoverable. But often the reality is that the culture is just waiting to hear something real, something true, something meaningful, something transcendent like the truth and the love of Jesus Christ that only God, of course, can provide. The culture actually yearns for these things. So the questions that I have for you this morning as we're closing is how can you best invest in our culture for the future? What are the signs of our times? What are they telling you? Are you a pessimist when maybe you should be an optimist, or even vice versa? I mean, I'm sure I'm wrong about some stuff. I'm sure I have, one view or the other, and maybe it should be very opposite. Are we under the assumption that it's the worst that it's ever been today, when the reality maybe is very opposite of that? And what does that say about our gratitude towards God if we are looking at what we have in this very opposite way of maybe what it actually is? How can and does an incorrect evaluation of our culture impede the advancement of God's work? I believe we are more than capable, through God, to be less than one generation away from substantial, significant cultural transformation. That the future is positive. That there are good days ahead for us, not only as a church, but as a country and as a world. That it's not the time to hunker down, to build defenses, or to pull back, but a time to advance, to conquer, and transform the world. To fully invest and leverage the freedoms that our culture gives us as Christians and use them for God's greater glory. The people in our culture are yearning for relationships with other people who have hearts like Jesus. They say this is one of the loneliest times people can live. People have almost no relationships that really matter. Very few, 1 or 0, most people in our culture. People are yearning for real relationships. They yearn for people with hearts like Jesus, who is the good shepherd, people who love the lost, who seek to care for them, and will even sacrifice their own well-being for their benefit, not only for them in this world, but for the next. And that love of God, carried forth by his disciples, has already transformed the world. It's already done that in the past. And that investment can and will transform our world in the future. I'm just going to close us in prayer.